Welcome to another episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And we want to welcome for the fifth time Mark D. White. Of course, as you know, he's a professor of philosophy at the College of Staten Island, CUNY, who has written widely on superheroes and philosophy, including the books Batman and Ethics and the Philosopher Reads series, and as well as contributions to many volumes in the Blackwell philosophy and pop culture series. And his new book, available now, is called The Virtues of Captain America: Modern Day Lessons on Character from a World War II Superhero, second edition. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be back here, guys. It always is.
Absolutely. And so, as we usually do, we're going to start off with a quote from Mark's book.
Yeah.
Mark wrote, "The original virtue ethicists incorporated wonderfully perceptive observations about human nature into their prescriptions for behaving morally and promoting the quote unquote good life. This allowed them to avoid the strict rules and formulas of the ethical systems that followed, and instead they offered the flexibility of moral judgment that people need to make decisions in complex real-world situations. As advanced as we like to think we are in the modern world, the essential moral problems of respecting each other, getting along, and working together have not changed much in the last several thousand years. In fact, because technology, along with its many gifts, has also expanded the scale and scope of the ways we can hurt each other, the lessons of the virtue ethicists are more important now than ever. And a quote unquote man out of time, such as Captain America, can see that better than anyone. Throughout this book, I'll argue that Cap's old-fashioned moral code is exactly what we need to restore kindness and respect in the 21st century in our personal and civic lives. He is what the ancient philosophers, yes, more ancient than Cap, called a moral exemplar. Today, we'll call him a role model. Both terms refer to a person we could look up to and use as an example of how to act in certain situations. Role models today are often political figures, entertainers, or athletes, all of whom are real people, whether dead or alive. But can a fictional character be a role model? So this is a question that we talked about a little bit in our episode on Thor, which was now like several years ago. And I think from my vague memory, I posed the question of like, what is sort of the boundary between like aspiring, let's say, to be a Captain America and between just trying to be a moral perfectionist, right? So, and I think that's kind of where I want to start off. But I also, just before we get into that, I want to kind of get a background of who Captain America is and why is the moral code for him so important.
Well, Captain America was the super soldier of World War II. He was a scrawny, scrappy little kid who wanted nothing more than to join the force against Hitler and the fascist threat against the Allied powers. But he was a tiny guy. He wasn't in good shape. He was sickly, so he was rejected by every army recruitment office he went to. And eventually, the leaders of a government secret government project called Project Rebirth, found this guy and said, "Wow, he never gives up, and he really wants to fight for his country, and he obviously hates bullies." And so they recruited him to take part in Project Rebirth and get the super soldier serum and the Vita rays that turn the scrawny Steve Rogers into the epitome of human physical perfection. And that merged with the virtues that he already had allowed him to become Captain America. And what I think makes Captain America so relevant in this day and age is just the how solid his bedrock principles are, and that he always tries to be honest and courageous and heroic and engages in self-sacrifice and puts others before him, stands up for the weak against the strong, doesn't put up with bullies, never gives up. And all of these are very general guidelines that don't tell us what exactly to do in any particular situation. But I argue throughout the book that if you keep these in mind and follow them and use judgment to decide how much or to what degree to follow each one in any particular situation, that's what Captain America does. And he often struggles with it, and he has to engage in compromise sometimes when one principle stands in the way of another. But I think that's a great way to go about our lives, trying to be good, trying to be better. And you mentioned perfectionism. I think there's a guy named Leon that's written a lot about perfectionism at Psychology Today lately.
Yeah.
You may know him. I don't know.
Thanks for the shout out.
He's not as good looking as you, but um, it's very easy, especially for someone like Captain America that pushes himself so hard and always wants to be better, and always feels he lets people down when by anyone else's standards he's done more than enough, but he always wants to do better. So I don't know if I actually use this term in the book, but I would definitely put him forward as a moral perfectionist, as I would most heroes that never think they do enough. And of course, that's a, a recipe for failure, because you can't be perfect and you can't be morally perfect. Immanuel Kant, one of my favorite philosophers and someone I cite a lot in the book, acknowledged this. And for those who don't know, Kant is often considered a very demanding ethicist himself.
Right.
So many people that are just basically familiar with his writing would say, of course, he's a moral perfectionist. He demands that everyone follow duty for the sake of duty, and but he was along the same spirit as what I just said about Cap. He wants people to try to do the right thing as much as they can, as often as they can, but he knows that we can't always do the right thing. We're not perfect. He very famously said, only God and the angels are perfect. We're human beings. We're animals. Okay, we've got our physical form and our kind of spiritual form. And because we are physical beings and we have temptations and we have desires and we have imperfect wills, we can't be moral perfectionists. And to treat ourselves like moral perfectionists, like I said, is a recipe, slow down, recipe for failure.
Mhm.
Right. But the thing is, the reason why people love Cap, definitely the reason why I love Captain America, is because since he's striving for that, that moral perfection, so to speak, right? At least to do always what's good, what's right. As far as humility goes, honor, integrity, just being in alignment with his purpose, getting others to try to follow his example. I don't know, something about the way he acts in almost every situation, it makes you really admire him,
Right.
right? Like, yeah, so I mean, even though you could call that a flaw, I mean, he feels like the least flawed out of maybe the other Marvel characters. I mean, that's probably why everybody loves him so much and follows him.
Right. And I agree with all that. But then you step in his shoes and realize, after he's saved a busload of children from an accident or a supervillain, and he does so with nobody getting hurt, and the villain got arrested, so they're going to be held accountable in a court of law, and everything was done right. Then he goes home and he says, "Oh, I could have done that faster. Oh, I risked that one person. They're fine, but yeah, maybe I didn't do this right. I got to do it better next time." And
Mhm.
that's what actually isn't virtuous. It
Right.
is that he's that hard on himself, and he doesn't realize, hey, I had a good day today.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean he has to let up on himself the next day. He's still got to try to do better if he wants, but he has to be more realistic in his self-assessment
Mm.
and say, I did pretty good today. And I mean, if he did make a mistake, if he actually someone did get hurt or someone almost got hurt, yeah, it's valid to assess that and say, why did that happen? Make sure that doesn't happen tomorrow. But the fact is, he's so hard on himself, and it's that perfectionist aspect of him that definitely, it's like with every superhero that I write about, like Batman or Captain America or
Mhm.
Daredevil, that just pushes themselves too far,
Mhm.
whether it's in terms of moral perfectionism or in terms of just 110% dedication to their mission without making room for the private human lives that everyone needs, even if just as a pressure valve,
Mhm.
so they don't snap like many people say Batman has.
Mm. All right, so Mark, I'm gonna ask you two really difficult questions, man. So, like, listen, I don't have the answer to them, so like, I just to give you some grace, I don't really expect you to, answer it successfully, but I just am curious what you think. So, this
Then
is
I
my
can
first.
beat myself up later
Yeah,
for
right,
not
right,
answering well enough. Yeah.
right. Okay,
Thank
so
you.
this is the first one. Okay, so ethically speaking, and as we're talking about perfectionism, so what's so interesting about being a perfectionist is one could say it's actually a hyper awareness of your flaws and also a hyper awareness of the flaws that you actually are able to change, right? So just to kind of create a fictitious scenario or like example, whatever, right? So imagine if Captain America is saving people, and let's say like what for whatever reason, like one ends up dying, right? So he ends up saving like 90% of the bunch. I mean, technically speaking, if like there's nothing, let's say, external kind of preventing him from doing it, like let's say, I don't know, maybe he was tired, I don't know, maybe he was depressed, whatever he was having a bad day, etc. Let's say something was more or less kind of internal was preventing him from saving that final person. Let's say it just took up too much energy, but not so much that it was kind of impossible for him to actually do, right? So
Mhm.
my question would be in that kind of scenario, right? Let's say he is a moral perfectionist and he is able to, or he does live with those regrets, right? And he is able to see kind of holistically the picture or the broad picture of his flaws, meaning, so we tend to like excuse away our flaws, right? So there's something called the fundamental attribution error in psychology, right?
Mhm.
So just for our audience, so what it means is like for ourselves, we actually tend to tell ourselves like, oh, hey, it's like, so let's say I'm gonna actually frame it from the other person's, or for the other person's perspective.
Mhm.
So for the other person, it's like, this person's lazy. There's something wrong with their character, essence, whatever. And then when it comes to me, right, here's like a million and one excuses of why like this wasn't my fault, right? So we tend to go on living being in the sense that like we're able to kind of talk ourselves out of self blame, right? So one can argue that with perfectionism, it's actually a kind of a deeper awareness of what you are responsible for. Meaning, again, if Captain America isn't able to save that like final person, if some can argue, but he kind of knew that he could have. It might have been extremely difficult to, right? And let's say it might have required that like extra, I don't know, push or that extra effort, but he knew for whatever reason, like he decided not to do it, and now he has to kind of live with that, right? So I guess here's what my question would be for you, right? So if we weren't going to talk Captain America out of that, right? So if we were going to say, okay, well, you know what, more or less, like you might be better than the norm, let's say, because maybe we wouldn't be able to do what you do, but even still, like you're kind of right, right? Like, I mean, you could have put in that extra effort again for whatever was that, internally that was stopping you. I mean, you're right. It was something more or less that you could have, as difficult as it was, you could have controlled, right? How would you help him deal with it? Or how would you kind of talk to him about moral perfectionism if you were to actually accept that, like, yeah, honestly, he's more or less right about these flaws about himself, meaning that he could have actually done better?
Well, going back to my response to Alan, I don't think that's necessarily moral perfectionism, or at least not in the extreme
Mhm.
negative sense of it. Because I mean, if there are valid self criticisms, if he could have actually done better, then I think that's valid to for him to assess later. Now, if he beats himself up for it and says, "Okay, well, I'm not going to have dinner tonight. I'm not going to have dessert tonight because I've got to punish myself for this failing," that's over the top too. But if he just gets home and says, "Oh, that one person died, I can't let this happen again.
Mhm.
I've got to figure out why I did it. Did something escape my attention? Was I distracted? Was I tired, depressed, whatever?" And make sure, or try to make sure, that doesn't happen tomorrow.
Right.
But I'm saying there's times in the comics where he'll get done with an adventure, and or a episode saving a bunch of people, and he'll get done and it won't seem that anything went wrong.
Mm.
But he'll go home and he'll start saying my reaction time was 2% too slow when
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
blocked that bullet from the terrorist's gun.
But
And I
could it have been
mean, it
faster?
was still twice as fast as I needed to be,
Mhm.
but there was a slight chance that it could have gone wrong. It
Mm.
was a 98% instead of a 99% chance of success. I don't even need 100, but I want 99.
Mhm.
So there are times when you'll see Cap just beating himself up, and there's two ways that extremism enters into this. One is being extremely demanding of yourself as far as the moral perfection or whatever perfectionism, and then also just once you've identified this major flaw, beating yourself up over it instead of saying, "Hey, I should have done that better. I'll keep this in mind for next time." Or I'll even tell my friends and colleagues and fellow superheroes, "Hey, watch me if I get distracted, or if I get too upset by this Nazi shooting his mouth off, because I know
Mhm.
that really sets me off. So if that happens, give me a nudge." And it's fine to enlist friends in this too, because I'm no expert on moral perfectionism, but I imagine that it typically it's a very isolated condition that you usually don't share with people around you, where that could help, I'm
Mm.
guessing.
Right. But then how does one live with the guilt of their sense of responsibility that he has, right? So let's say on the one hand, he knows, let's say I'm hypothetically speaking, let's say if we're going to focus on some subset of the comics, meaning let's leave out like, the Justice League people outside of this, right? So let's say imagine like he's the only superhero in this universe, right? And so how does he live with the guilt that knowing he was fully responsible for something either happening or not happening? And that ultimately, again, if we're taking into consideration that he is aware of a flaw and something that he could have done better, that did have, maybe a significant consequence, how does he then live with that sort of guilt?
I don't know if there's anything to tell him, given the way he sees himself
Hmm.
as the sentinel of liberty, as the defender of freedom, as the champion of the American dream. Everything falls on him, especially if he's, like you said, the only hero around. Everything falls on him. So I wrote a chapter for Dr. Strange in philosophy where I talked about how Dr. Strange takes on the responsibility for fighting all the supernatural threats because he's the only major superhero in the Marvel universe that does that type of magic. So the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, the Defenders, they handle all the typical supervillains and world conquerors and alien invasions. Doctor Strange is the only one that knows about all the threats from the mystical dimensions. And so he's the only person that can confront this. And the chapter in that book, and it's a recurring theme in many of the heroes I write about, is this tremendous responsibility that he feels, and how it's not really healthy, but in a narrative perspective, you kind of want your hero to have that
Hmm.
because that adds to the drama of the hero. Okay, Daredevil has no, other than the enhanced senses, he has no physical, strength, extra strength or speed, but he still holds himself responsible for everything that happens in Hell's Kitchen, a very small area of New York City. And Batman does the same thing for Gotham. And it's that's why I'm careful in my books to emphasize this is not something to be emulated. This is not a virtue. This is a vice. It's not a vice like greed or anything, but it's a vice in the sense that it's an improper balancing of attitudes towards this. I mean, Captain America has a certain amount of responsibility. He has more than most of us have because that's what he's taken on. But that doesn't mean that he's responsible for every single thing that goes wrong when he's in the area. And so
Right.
you've got to have an appropriate balance of this. But again, if you had that balance, it wouldn't make for very dramatic storytelling. It would be
Yeah.
healthy in terms of this was a person we actually knew.
Hmm.
And if he said, I've got to realize I've got my limitations, I'm not responsible for everything, so I'm going to let up on myself. And if that was a person we knew, we'd be like, wow, that's great. That's growth. That's fantastic. But
Hmm.
for a fictional character that we want to the most dramatic storytelling we can have. It's kind of like, when people ask me all the time when I talk about Batman not killing the Joker and says, I make arguments why not killing the Joker is actually counterproductive to Batman's mission. And then people always ask me, well, do you think Batman should kill the Joker? And I say, no, 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 because that torments him. And then they're all shocked because, oh, you want Batman to be tormented? I'm like, yes, I want this fictional character
Hmm.
whose dramatic travails we thrill to be tormented. That's what makes him an entertaining, fascinating character.
Hmm.
I don't want a real person to be tormented,
Right.
but I do want my fictional characters to have a certain amount of drama in their lives because that keeps me reading and watching.
No, absolutely. When it comes to furthering the story along, I'm in total agreement with you. What I would say though is that even though Captain America beats himself up over maybe mistakes or any misgivings, uh, in the end, anyway, through just that sheer sort of indomitable will, like even if he gets knocked down, he gets back up. He's so persistent as far as that goes. He doesn't give up, right? So he does have, there's an evolution to like the judgments that he makes as far as that
Yeah,
goes.
Oh, can you actually talk about that? I'm curious. What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, so um essentially, so for example, there was a, I believe, a reference in the book to a one of the comics where there was I forget the name of the villain. It's like a snake, of Madam Viper, maybe,
yeah.
maybe,
There's a lot
maybe.
of snake. There's a serpent society in his world, so there's a lot of snake themed villains.
Right. So there was essentially like the henchmen of that particular villain, they were poisoned, while the main villain is, getting away. And then Captain America and then his the person who's with him, the other superhero, they're at a crossroads. They're making a decision. Well, not for Captain America. Captain America is resolute on this, but the idea is the other hero that's with him is saying, we can leave these guys. They're bad anyway. Let's go after the main villain. That person's going to cause the most harm, which is, you can argue even utilitarian, right?
The kind
In a
of
way.
trolley problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Captain America's like, no, I have these people in front of me. I don't care if they're villains. I can't let them die. That would be wrong, right? And so, like, when he encounters things like that, of course, he does what he believes is correct and the moral choice. Respect 100% for that. However, there are things like that happens that, of course, furthers the story along. And yes, the villain will then do something even worse, and Captain America will be like, crap, maybe I should have stopped them earlier when I had the chance. But the thing is, he'll still make a decision like at the time that still follows his ideals, but he will think about that later, and then sometimes he has to make certain compromises, ethical compromises, in order to understand what is really perhaps the best action to take. But he's still not utilitarian in that aspect. He's still striving for what's morally correct. So you see him balance these decisions in many different storylines.
Wait, so what's interesting? So now this actually leads into my second difficult question for Mark.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, but this one I think you'll enjoy much more. Okay, so as you know, the two major competing systems of ethics at this point are deontology, which we talked about with Kant, this sort of absolute version of morality that there always is a right and wrong, and we, more or less are supposed to kind of intuit what that is, or reason what that is, maybe a better way of saying it. And then you also have obviously utilitarianism, right? So for, let's say, Captain America, one could argue that, let's say, if you are an absolutist, right, that's a kind of very neat way of looking at the world, meaning circumstances are really simple, right? There's always a right and a wrong, black and white. And that, all we have to do is just try, right, to live up to that. So what would you then, or how would you then either perceive Captain America, or how would you kind of explore it or address it with him, right? If we actually took the more or less utilitarian view of the world, right? So if we, what?
And sorry, I have to add this because you're bringing in both of these. Okay. If we could bring civil war into this,
well, I was going to say this sounds like it's setting up a Captain America versus Iron Man, because that's at least in what I've written about the prototypical, conflict between Cap, to what extent he's a deontologist, versus Iron Man's very utilitarian point of view.
Right. So yeah, so and this is how like I would frame it, right? If you're going again into utilitarianism, right, we would say, okay, so the world is messy, right? So if somebody were a moral perfectionist, technically speaking, every moral perfectionist would have to live with some sense of guilt, right? So what I mean is that every decision you're making is always going to have trade-offs. So just using Alan's example, meaning if, like, let's say you're taking the utilitarian perspective and you're saying, okay, I'm going to go catch this like more I don't know, guys in the hierarchy, like this more important bad guy, right? So I'm going to catch him and I'm going to let these bad guys go. So if these bad guys are let go, maybe they're going to kill X amount of people, but at the very least, we prevent further calamities because we caught the main villain, right? So what I'm saying is, if we're taking the more complex perspective, which is, I mean, maybe this is it is biased, but that's my perspective of the world, meaning every decision has trade-offs. So meaning that it's not so clear often what the moral choice is. It's more like there are two moral decisions that may not necessarily be of equal value, but at the very least, like, we have to pick one, right? So we have to do, so we have to do something.
Yeah,
right?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right. So then how would you address, let's say again, Captain America's moral perfectionism, if you were to come at it from a utilitarian perspective and say, well, like, Cap, I mean, technically speaking, as you're making one moral choice, there's a moral choice that you missed out on. And technically there are maybe not necessarily casualties, but in some ways, yes, right? So in some ways, just like the trolley problem, I mean, somebody has to die, not obviously metaphorically speaking. Right. So something bad has to happen for you to make a good decision, right? So if you're Captain America and you're a moral perfectionist and you're thinking, okay, if I could just figure out like what that right choice is, right, I don't have to feel this guilt anymore, right? How would you address that in being a utilitarian and saying, like, Cap, dude, like, this is kind of not realistic? Or would you say that?
I mean, everything you're saying sounds like how I describe Captain America's struggles with making the right choice. but utilitarianism rarely plays into them.
Mm.
You know, it can in a secondary way, and this is something I've written about in my scholarly writing as well as my superhero writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when, you know, even for a deontologist, even for a Kantian who identifies, you know, Kant did not write very much about when you have two duties that conflict. Let's say it's just as simple as you absentmindedly promise to be in two different places at the same time, helping two different people.
Right.
And you know, it was stupid. You shouldn't have done that. But now you've got two promises, both of which you should keep, but you cannot possibly keep them both.
Right.
And Kant said, and I mean, it was less than a sentence. He said, you have one duty, you have conflicting obligations. You have to choose the obligation with the stronger ground, and that is your duty. And then you follow your duty. You can only have one operative duty, but those duties are based on obligations. If you have conflicting obligations, you follow the one with the literally, this is what he said in English, stronger ground of obligation.
Mm-hmm.
And then he went on to his next topic
Mm.
and did not elaborate on what that means. So some of my more scholarly writing has been trying to fill in the gaps of what that might mean. And I think at that point, you're allowed to bring utilitarian or consequentialist thinking in. Because, you know, let's say you've made these two promises. And this is kind of the example I use in my writing. I say, let's say one is your promise to help your mother, your elderly mother, move into a new apartment.
Mhm.
And the other is a promise made to an old high school friend you haven't seen in 20 years to have coffee to catch up.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Still a promise.
Yep.
Promise and a promise. Okay. You have a duty to keep your promises. Okay. But then when you back up and say, well, I mean, come on, stronger ground of obligation. Who do I owe more obligation to? My mother or this guy from high school that I don't even really remember? But I
Mhm.
made a promise to, but you know, still. Okay. Or you can have, or they can be two people of equal meaning to you, two people that mean them as much to you, have similar affection to.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say one, you're helping them move because they really need to get into a new apartment today to start a new job, and the other one is just to catch up.
Mhm.
Okay. So then you know, some utilitarian thinking comes in. Well, which promise is going to do the most good?
Right.
You know, each promise is going to help one person, but the promise to the first person is definitely going to do more good.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to make someone much happier than just meeting for coffee to catch up.
Mhm.
So when you've got these two principles, obligations, duties, whatever you want to call them in ordinary language, and they're conflicting, I say, you know, if there's not another principled way to split the difference, why not bring in consequences in utilitarianism?
Mhm.
If there's no print, you know, you don't have you if there's a principled way to make the decision,
Right.
then obviously you use that. But if
Mhm.
the principles kind of, you know, balance each other out and you need something else to split the tie, there's no reason not to bring utilitarianism in. Another example I use is, you know, you have a superhero chasing two bank robbers down an alley. At the end of the alley, one goes left, one goes right. Which one do you chase? You can't chase both.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Maybe you chase the one that's obviously the leader. Maybe you chase the one that's carrying the loot. Maybe you
Right.
chase the one that you think will lead you to their leader. You know, which are all utilitarian or consequentialist considerations.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Because there's no, you know, if it was, you know, if the two people, one of them was a thief and one of them was a hostage, and
Mhm.
they split at the end, obviously you chase the thief. There's no reason to chase the hostage unless you're just making sure they're okay.
Right.
So there's a principled reason to chase one of them there. But if it's two thieves and there's no principled reason to choose one over the other, you're allowed to bring in, you know, considerations of utility or consequentialism or the relative good you would do in either case.
Mm. So would you say that there's a degree of, I mean, maybe this is off, but I do want to ask anyway. So would you say that there's maybe a degree of hubris on Captain America's end? Meaning if, let's say, we're more or less like utilitarians, meaning we understand, again, there are trade-offs. We have like these existential limits that all of us obviously have, or the vast
But
majority of us have.
that's not exclusive to utilitarianism, though.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, I said a few minutes ago that Kant realized we're all imperfect. and we
Well,
all have limitations,
true,
and
true,
we
true.
can
But
all only do so much.
but I want to reference this in the context of Captain America, right? So
Okay.
for his moral perfectionism, right? So how would we address his guilt in sort of helping him accept his limitations? So to say like, look, Cap, like, we have these trade-offs. We can't do everything.
Well, I mean, obviously, excessive guilt is a problem, but I don't know if there's any. I mean, I don't have any way to talk him out of that
Mm,
other than just to sit him down and say, listen, you do more than enough. You're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. And he'd say, well, of course I know that, but I still feel I have to do everything.
right.
But I want to go back. You mentioned hubris, and I'm just curious what exactly is that in reference to Cap believing that he knows the right thing to do before he does it?
Oh, great question. Yeah. So it's more along the lines of like, so I wasn't referring to that specifically. It was more about the ability to follow through on particular decisions or, I don't know, I guess
Okay.
volitions, choices, whatever, right? So it's less about the reasoning behind what the right choice is, even though we should definitely talk about that. But it's more along the lines of what can I actually achieve, right? So let's say I decided to save these 10 people. And again, I was only able to save nine. And oh my God, I feel so terrible about myself, right? And it's sort of like, how is it really ever addressed in the comics, right? Where somebody does sit him down and say, like, Captain, like, dude, you're literally the best that we have. Like, there's nobody that can really do more than this. Like, how are you doing this to yourself?
I can't recall any specific instances of that, but I know people have mentioned this to him. I don't know if anyone sat him down
Yeah.
and smacked him upside the head and say,
Hmm.
listen, he doesn't need, he may need that,
Hmm.
but I don't remember, but his fellow superheroes, especially his fellow Avengers, always say to him, oh, you're too hard on yourself, you have to take it easy. And he says, none on my watch,
So it never
I
works, right?
can't.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. But I
Hmm.
mean, no one, I don't remember anyone actually sitting him down and trying to get through to him.
Mm.
Possibly because they realize he's useful that way. I mean, the fact that he pushes himself so hard is bad for him, but it's good for everybody that he gives 110% to save. It's
Wow.
kind of like when, a few years ago when Batman and Catwoman were supposed to get married,
Hmm.
and Catwoman ran out at the last minute because she said, I want Batman to be happy. He deserves to be happy, but I don't think he'll be an effective Batman if he's happy, and the world needs basically an unhappy Batman. And I mean, this is
Wow.
the whole other can of
Wow.
worms.
Hmm.
But this was Catwoman, sacrificing her own romantic future, destroying his,
Hmm.
but for the purpose of keeping him broken, you can say, in a
I
certain
agree with
way,
her.
because that makes him a more obsessive, extreme crime fighter.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
I'm saying that's kind of the same thing with Captain America. Yes, we
Yeah.
can all sit
Yeah.
around and say, oh, you beat yourself up too much, but maybe that pushes him
Hmm.
too hard from his own point of view, or our point of view being sympathetic towards him. But in terms of America's point of view, or the American people, the world, whoever benefits from him, they want him to be obsessing over every little detail
Hmm.
because they want him to be the most effective superhero he can be. Now, if
Hmm.
this reaches the point where, let's say, he's so obsessed with this moral perfectionism that he goes out in the field and then he has, decision paralysis, and he's
Hmm.
like, "Oh my gosh, I made a bad decision last time." No, sorry, blocking my mouth. Oh my gosh, I made a bad decision last time. What if I do that again?
Hmm.
I don't know what to do. I don't, what button do I push? Which lever do I press? I don't know because I don't want to make a mistake again. So this is one way I can see that would backfire. And if that backfired, then that would definitely make him a less effective superhero. And someone should definitely step in and say, listen, you don't have to be perfect. Your decision making is right 99% of the time. You have to trust in yourself,
Hmm.
which he does. But I'm saying if he ever went too far with that and that actually created doubt in his mind, this happens a lot with Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. I've been rereading the Fantastic Four, getting ready for a book on that later.
Oh,
And one, Reed Richards constantly pushes himself to make, using a scientific genius, not necessarily, great moral judgment in all cases, but his obviously scientific genius and being able to track every detail and keep an eye on everything and come to the right decision. But every once in a while he screws up, and then he does have the decision paralysis where he's out in the field and the rest of them say, Reed, what do we do now? And he's like, I'm not sure. And they're like, Reed, we need a decision. Yeah. And this really fits in the story, because if you're familiar with the Fantastic Four's origins, the four of them go off on this space flight. They get hit by cosmic rays, which the spaceship wasn't sufficiently shielded for, and they all get transformed into the superpowered beings they are. But Reed has had everlasting guilt about that, because he changed the lives of his three closest friends. Maybe for better, maybe for worse, but they're definitely changed because of a mistake he feels he made. Because he didn't know the cosmic rays were going to be there. He didn't shield the spaceship enough. He didn't decide to have the launch a different day. So even if there's no way, and they always say back to him, Reed, you took into account everything you possibly could. It was a freak accident. There's no way you could have predicted it. And he's like, no, I should have been on top of it. I'm so sorry. I ruined your lives. And so every time he does make even a minor mistake in the field, this brings all this back. Oh my gosh, I screwed up just like I screwed up way back when. And I can't screw up again. And maybe, and that's where he does get into the decision paralysis. But this never happens to Cap, because Cap's always so sure. If he has to do something, he has to make a decision. And even if maybe later on he'll realize the decision was wrong, he has to make a decision now. And then once he makes a decision, he acts on it, because there's no reason not to, if you're sure, at least at that moment, that you've made the right decision. And I thought that might be what you meant by hubris, because many people see him that way. And many people have gone back to him in the comics, say, are you always sure you're right? And he says, no, I'm never sure I'm right. But if I have to make a decision, I have to make the best decision I can at that time with the information I have and move on it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, maybe a better term than hubris would have been excessive self-confidence.
And as a leader, he has to do that. I mean, as to be a good leader, you have to do that. You have to make snap decisions. That's why people follow him. Like, yes, he could be sure of the wrong thing, but because he's sure, taking into account all that he possibly could, with the information given, people respect him for that. People follow him for that. And he does what he thinks is right. He may find out, okay, I was missing this variable later, and then
he'll
adjust.
certainly accept if people tell him that.
Yeah.
They'll say, Cap, you didn't think of this, or you missed this, or, I think you should have made this decision. And he'll completely respect that. Yeah. As a confident, not overconfident, but as a confident, secure leader does. They accept criticism from the people they lead, and they incorporate that into their decision making. And Cap certainly does that. And especially as hard as Cap is on himself, he may actually be almost too welcoming of criticism. Because he's like, hey, guys, I'm beating myself up. Want to join me? And none of them want to, because like, dude, you did an awesome job. And he says, no, I could have done this better. I could have done that better. But, he is willing to accept that. But, if he doesn't, all the arguments that he has had with Iron Man over the years, where they just come at things from different perspectives. He'll say, I respect what you're saying, but I disagree. I can't do it that way.
And actually, I'm happy you brought that up. That's something I wanted to get back to. How would you describe Iron Man's and Captain America's ethical stances, and what their conflict could reveal to us? What could we learn from their conflict during the Civil War arc?
Okay, well, the Civil War is just one example of Captain America and Iron Man's, kind of historical opposition, because they really do exemplify what Leon identified as the two main contracting views of at least action-based ethics. Virtue ethics is kind of separate, because that evaluates someone's character, someone's person. But when we're talking about evaluating actions as moral or immoral or permissible, it's mainly the two contrasting alternatives are deontology and utilitarianism. And Cap and Iron Man definitely fit into those two schools, where Captain America always wants to do the right thing, where Iron Man wants to do the most good. And I don't want to exaggerate the opposition between these two schools, because on most ethical topics they agree, even for different reasons. So both of them would say, don't hurt people, don't kill people, don't lie, try to help people, be the best person you can be, all that. But it's when you get into these situations of trade-offs
Mm-hmm.
that it really becomes most apparent. And so you have, especially, the phrase that deontologists use, that the ends don't necessarily justify the means. And deontologists say this: yes, we want to save all these people, but we're not going to kill the villains to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
Where Iron Man would be, if he were pushed to the limit, he would say, listen, ordinarily we wouldn't, but in this case we ought to.
Mm-hmm.
And Cap would argue back, oh, that's just expedient, you're just taking the easy way out, we have to think more. And Iron Man would say, we don't have time, we have to make a decision now, you should know this, let's go forward.
Mm-hmm.
So you had a huge, huge in the sense of galactic proportions, disagreement over a recent storyline, or recent, like 10 years ago, that was included in the new edition of the book, where the heroes have become aware that Earths from alternate dimensions are coming into our universe and threatening to collide. So you
Mm-hmm.
have these what are called incursions,
Mm-hmm.
and planets are colliding. And of course, that's the ultimate, blown up trolley problem, right? Is obviously we can't let the people on our planet die, but how do we do this without killing the people on the other planet, or letting them all die?
Mm-hmm.
So and the rest of the what was called the Illuminati, the big brains of the Marvel
Mm-hmm.
universe, um, are thinking this through, and they tried different ways. They use the Infinity Gauntlet with Infinity Stones to try to repel the other Earth. I think that works once, but then the gauntlet blows up, and so they don't have that for the next one. They try all these ways, shift it into a different dimension, all these things, and they finally say, listen, next time we're just going to have to blow up the other planet. And Captain America says, I knew you'd say that. There's this one panel that I love to use with people that I know on the internet named Anthony, which is just Captain America saying, what the hell are you thinking, Anthony?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just, Captain America says, I knew all you guys were going to get to this point. I was just wondering how long it would take.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, Captain America, we've exhausted all the alternatives, what else can we do? He says, we can't stop thinking. We have to think of something. I have
Right.
to believe that if we keep thinking, we'll figure this out. And the rest of them are like, we've tried everything we can, there's nothing else we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And he's
Right.
like, no, we never give up. And at that point, it does sound very utopian, it does sound very perfectionist,
Right.
tilting at windmills, whatever metaphor you want to use, where when you get down to it, at the end of the day, you have exhausted all your choices and you have to do something. Cap was probably too stubborn in that case, but again, that's what we want him to do. We want him to be the last bulwark of stubbornness. And in fact, the other heroes need that too, because the other heroes need him to push them to exhaust every alternative until they run out.
Right.
Because Tony would definitely be the one who, when the first incursion came, well, blow it up. And the rest of them would say, no, no, we have to think of something. And Tony would say, nah, I already thought of everything. It's not going to work. Blow it up.
It's true.
But
Yeah.
that's the polar difference between Iron Man and Captain America. The rest of them in the middle are some sort of combination that, like, yeah, we might have to blow it up eventually, but let's make sure we've exhausted all the alternatives first.
And if I'm not mistaken, that storyline ended with the actual Marvel universe kind of being destroyed. Am I wrong? Yeah.
No, that's exactly right. Spoiler alert. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, fans. But yeah, so that's interesting, right? I mean, so I do love Captain America for thinking, no, there's still something maybe that we can think of. Even though people are counseling and telling him, no, we've really thought of every possible thing. Um, I kind of like that because at least he's saying, I'm not willing to sacrifice someone else. It's not part of my ideals. If we have to go out and there's nothing else that we can do, with the exception of sacrificing our ideals, it's not worth sacrificing our ideals. We should then just go out, and that's our fate. But somebody like Stark, yeah, he would argue, no, 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 no. Like, we really should value like self-preservation. Somebody should survive out of all of this. Like, somebody should go on. uh and yeah, so then you sometimes do question Captain America's judgment, because maybe you don't want, like, even as the reader, you don't want, like, in that particular universe, like, certain heroes dying. And so it's rough.
Can I can I
Please,
piggyback?
please,
Okay,
please.
so I want to kind of give you a quick anecdote, and then now I want to ask you another difficult question. Difficult question number three. All right, so this actually made me think. So I mean, for our audience, you guys obviously know. So my mentor Tim Stroop, so he had he had a really great story that he once told us, like while we were at the table together. So his mentor, so at Oxford at the time, another fellow philosopher, John Mackey. So he wrote a paper. I don't remember the exact class. It might have been an ethics class, might have been something else. So he writes this paper, right? So Mackey hands it back to him, and there's nothing there, like no feedback, no criticism. At the last page, it just says it can be better, right? So Tim gets pissed off, and he's like, "This motherfucker, it can be better." He's like, "You know what? Fuck you. Okay, I'll do that." Well, he doesn't curse, so I'm just saying that. So he was like, "Okay, it could be better," right? So he types it up, he redoes it, says, "Okay," hands it in to him again, right? Mackey hands it back to him. He says, "It can be better." He's like, "This fucking guy, I cannot believe it." And then so he's like, "You know what? Okay, fine." He's like, he types it, redoes it again, right? Sends it into him the third time, right? And literally at the end, he writes his own note. It cannot be better, right? And then so finally, Mackey gives it back to him, and then like he doesn't have a grade, right? So but he just gives back to him a paper with his own or like whatever comment or whatever, either at the end or in the margins, and he writes, "Okay, now I'm ready to read it."
Oh,
Yeah.
geez.
So okay, so now to contrast my question with that story, right? So with something like that, moral, like, not in this case, it's not so much about morality, it's more like, I don't know, academic or whatever, self-serving perfectionism. But let's say, okay, we now go into the moral realm, right? So the difference between like that story and let's say somebody like Captain America is that, like, with somebody like Mackie, he was doing it to help Tim, right? So he was trying to actually, like, I don't know, foster his development, make him more intellectually curious, eliminate some of that hubris, whatever, right? So but in the case of Captain America, and this is where the difficulty comes up, right? Because here's what I would wonder: is there a point where, unlike like this example with Tim, where like let's say, I mean, at some point, again, these aren't the stakes aren't significant for him, meaning that like either Tim kind of redoes it or he doesn't do it. I mean, either way, he was in the fucking doctoral program, he was gonna do fine, right? No, this wasn't really gonna affect his academic
That's not
career.
high stakes. I remember it being rather high stakes. No.
I hear you, right? So okay, and now we're going into the realm of Captain America, right? And he is this moral perfectionist. And but where do we get to the point where, okay, let's say he's in conflict with Iron Man, and Iron Man says, like, "Look, dude, like if we don't make a decision, this shit can go bad for everybody," right? So when do we get to the point where not only is Captain America now just being incredibly fucking annoying, but he's actually now actually being immoral because he's actually like foregoing making a decision, and he's actually blocking other people from making the best decision possible?
No, I think they definitely reached that point.
Mm-hmm.
you know and what they did in the story is they wiped his memory of the entire episode and then got rid of him,
Hmm.
and then he finds it out much later, and of course he
Wow.
gets really mad at them and goes back at them and said, boy, you guys made it even worse.
Mm-hmm.
You want to do something bad, you knew it was bad, so you got rid of the one guy who told you it was bad, and now you're paying for it. But like I said before, he should have realized at some point that the stakes were so high
Right.
that there's a concept I talk about in the book of threshold deontology that basically says deontology is all well and good until the costs of your principles get too high, not necessarily for yourself but for other people,
Right.
because you're willing, anyone that considers themselves principled is willing to bear the costs of their principles to themselves. But the problem is when other people are going to bear those costs. So that's why villains take hostages, right? So they can put the hostage in danger and make the hero compromise their principles to save the hostage.
Mm.
And what Captain America just refused to see through all this literally galactic cataclysm was that the stakes are so tremendously high that we can't just afford to sit around and brainstorm a little more. while this keeps happening, like every day a new Earth comes in and we've managed to repel them, but we're out of ideas for the next one. But he just refused to. And you said that's unethical of him. I'd kind of be inclined to agree with that. That at some point he has to say, okay, this is at this point, these simplistic versions of morality break down, and we're talking literally about billions of lives. So it's either let the Earths collide and everyone dies, or we take out the other Earth and half the people in the situation live.
Right.
I can't remember if anyone pointed this out. Someone probably did, but they said, you got to imagine there's people on that other Earth that are thinking the same thing about us. So while we're waiting to decide what to do, they may be getting the cannon ready. And so yeah, so I mean, I agree with the heroes that he confronts throughout this scenario, that say, listen, Cap, you have to at some point have to say, okay, we have to do something. It's like there's the classic story that I spent a lot of time on in the book, for relative to it being only one issue, where he shoots the terrorist in the church. Whereas there's for the benefit of your listeners who haven't read the book for some reason yet, he's chasing this terrorist group called Ultimatum, and he's disguised as one of them, including having a rifle. So he finds that the Ultimatum agents have taken over a church with several hundred parishioners inside, and he hears gunfire and screams. So they're starting to massacre the parishioners. And he's too far away to throw a shield and do any good. The only thing he can do is take the rifle and take out the main gunman in the church. And snap decision, he does it. And he saves a lot of lives, but he took a life himself. And this plays out over the next couple of years of his title. Both the way that the public sees him differently, because it gets all blown out of proportion in the media, if you can imagine that. And also, he just beats himself up for it. Not because he thinks he made the wrong decision in the moment, but because he should have prepared better so he wasn't in that situation at that moment. He should have, been several steps ahead, so he wasn't in a situation where he had to kill somebody with a gun to save hundreds of lives. So it's not that he questions that decision he made, he questions the fact that he put himself in that situation to make that decision. But the fact that he did it, that he made the snap judgment and say, listen, this is the lesser of two evils. But he was unable to do that in this tremendously more consequential galactic, cataclysm. And that I realize for storytelling purposes, you want to have your one most resolute, most principled hero not give in to that, but also given the stakes of this situation,
but it actually
he should have.
It actually, to me, makes him a better person, because if you think about it, if he is such a moral perfectionist, let's say, hypothetically speaking, he can't tolerate the guilt of harming another person, making a bad decision, whatever, right? And if you're saying that, okay, he's actually doing a good because it's good, and then he knows he has to live with the guilt, one could even argue that actually is what makes him a moral perfectionist, or a moral would that actually not makes him a moral perfectionist? That is an example of moral perfection, meaning he's doing something for other people, and he's now choosing to live with the guilt, which to him up until that point has felt or been intolerable.
Right. In other words, he always chooses the right decision regardless of the costs to himself.
Right.
Including possible guilt having to live with this decision that, again, was right at the time, but he wishes he wouldn't have had to have made it.
And there's two places I want to go. One, I definitely do want to steer us back, right, to how he's a moral exemplar and what the 5 virtues are, and kind of getting to the point of how, no, this is somebody who's really great to emulate, right? He has his flaws, and we've explored them quite heavily, actually, this episode, more than I expected, but it's definitely useful. But I would like to get to that. But then also, I guess before we get into how he embodies the 5 virtues and what they are,
you're not going to ask me what they are you?
Well,
I can never answer. I always told my students, when I taught economics, and there'd be 5 determinants of demand, 5
Mhm.
things that shift the demand curve, like
Yeah.
income and population and stuff. I always told my students, I will never ask you on an exam to give me all 5,
Mhm.
because you put me on the spot, I cannot name all 5.
That's funny.
I can
That's fair.
apply one, I can apply any one you give me,
Mhm.
but I can't just recite the 5. It's like reciting the state capitals,
You need like an
right?
ocean model. Like, in the big five personalities, like if you use the term ocean, like you're just like, oh, openness to experience, neuroticism. You
Yeah,
could kind of fill it in. Yeah. It's too
yeah,
bad
like
you
a
don't have that
mnemonic.
here. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's fine. Yeah, courage, humility, righteous indignation, sacrifice, and responsibility and perseverance. Okay, I
There
had
we
to
go.
look
Okay.
it up
Okay,
simultaneously.
see, that's what I'm saying. Please don't ask me all 5, because I won't do it.
Definitely
Can't do it.
won't. But what I wanted to sort
And
of,
I'll
I
beat
guess,
myself up about it later. But
of course. But one thing I wanted to explore is actually so in in the book you make reference to one of the comics where there's something called the sentient cosmic cube, which
mm,
creates an alternate version of Captain America who's like a fascist
mhm.
and embraces those sort of ideals and is like basically not but almost basically the opposite of Captain America, except um, super pro fascist ideals. Right now, I have a question about that because I didn't fully understand this while reading, so I just need a little clarification.
Okay.
Is this an alternate universe, Captain America, with a like in a different world, or is it just they created an like just an opposite Captain America, and then the real Captain America exist simultaneously, like in the same
No,
way?
this is the normal Captain America with his memories altered.
Okay,
So
then yes.
he remembers being raised in a fascist group called Hydra, which is the comic book version of the Nazi Party. So he remembers being raised Hydra to infiltrate the US and be their super soldier and basically a sleeper agent until he's activated, and then he can lead the Hydra takeover of America.
Then, in that case, I have to ask this. So, for example, if we saw somebody who, let's say we knew someone who's normally a good person, but they commit a crime, we would call that person a criminal, expect them to go to jail, and they're no longer, at least in the eyes of, I mean, unless they, I guess, repent and do some kind of penance and maybe rehabilitate themselves. But barring that, you would consider that person a bad guy. Now, if Captain America, right, gets corrupted, now, of course, he's not himself. We understand that as the reader. He's been corrupted by this other organization, but now his actions that he takes in the world, whether he normally would have chosen them under a different, perspective, he takes those actions. Therefore, at that point, is he is are his virtues gone? Like in the sense, is he no longer someone you could even consider virtuous? Just be for the fact that like he's no longer operating virtuously,
Right.
for
Well, he
lack
no
of better.
longer has those character traits that we find, admirable.
Mm.
Yeah, I
So
guess that's pretty on the nose. Yeah, now
yeah,
it's. I guess what's
But wait, but
interesting.
wait. Interesting though. Okay, but wait. But if he is like, let's say, pro-fascist, right? Doesn't he embody some set of virtues for that particular community though?
Oh well, right. Peace through strength is one of the ideals,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to peace through
Right.
not justice. I'm forgetting, but essentially something more noble.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, all right. I guess I don't know what I had in my head, but I was thinking, oh, like if somebody that good could be, corrupted, like, are they overall still this paragon of
right,
virtue? But
right. Well, I
remember,
think no, I think I see what you're saying, and it kind of goes back to my little bit of discomfort when you said if someone commits a crime, we think of them as a bad person, and I wanted to push back on that
right?
because you know I'm not endorsing criminal behavior, but people do things that break the law for a wide number of reasons, and they may be good reasons, they may be bad reasons that really don't matter if they broke the law, but that can matter in terms of the way we evaluate them as whether they're still good people or bad people.
Mm.
All right.
I
Civil
mean,
disobedience.
someone who goes out and let's try not to make this as vicious as necessary, but let's just say there's a person that likes to go out and hit people with a baseball bat.
Hmm.
and does this all the time and just does it for the glee of it.
Mm-hmm.
Just does it for the joy of it. Likes to see people suffer. Just a psychopath.
Sure.
And and they finally get arrested and put in jail. And we would say, wow, this is a bad person. I mean, I don't think there'd be any reason not to call him a bad person. We can talk about what made the person this way, the way that he was abused as a child, all that. We can go into that. But, just looking at his actions and the reason he performs them. But then you get to the other example of the father who loses his job and his family is camping out in a park, and he breaks into or he steals some bread off a stall to feed his family, which is technically a crime, but obviously, morally speaking, it can be covered by necessity.
Right.
Yes, it was a crime, but he's not a bad person. He was a desperate person at the end of his rope that did break a law, but for the good of feeding his family.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So
Sure.
I think what this really gets down to is we can't just evaluate a person through their actions. We have to, go deeper and look at their character.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Was this person stealing the bread a habitual thief? Were they a burglar before they, well, then they lose their job? That'd actually be a good thing. But, if their job is burgling. But
Yeah.
you get what I'm saying, though.
Sure.
And this gets back to what you're saying about Cap. The normal Captain America we think of has all these admirable virtues that we want to emulate. And what the sentient cosmic cube did was basically turn all this on its head. So we basically have a mirror image Captain America. And he's now exemplifying all these character traits that are the opposite of what we think of as virtuous. So now he's arrogant. Now he's does not respect people. Now he believes in power over principle. So it's more that his new character traits or whatever we want to call them are not necessarily out of line with his original personal character traits. They're out of line with what we consider his character traits based on American values of liberty and equality and justice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the way that fascism contradicts the American project.
Mm-hmm.
This fascism is all about power and exploiting weakness and promoting an us versus them mindset,
Right.
and creating conflict within the population, setting one group against another.
Mm-hmm.
So that those all stand opposed to American principles. So I think it's really the idea that this new version of Captain America, who I call Hydra Cap,
Mm-hmm.
is really stands in opposition to the American ideals that the real Captain America stood up for.
And what is the explanation for why he embodies those vices as opposed to virtues? Like, how would he understand it? Would he consider them virtues?
I think you mean the Hydra Cap.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, he would consider them virtues because this is what he was raised to believe were the right thing. So, like you
Right.
said, in his community, in the Hydra community, these are the quote unquote virtues they were taught at school.
Mm-hmm.
You beat up the weak, you support the state,
Mm-hmm.
you believe what the leader tells you.
Yep.
And that's what they were indoctrinated with from an early age.
Mm-hmm.
And so he believes this is right. And in fact, early on in the story, he actually kills the Red Skull. And this was the Red Skull's plan all along. He used the Cosmic Cube to turn Steve Rogers this way because this was the ultimate revenge against Steve Rogers and America, is turn Steve Rogers into the instrument of fascism. But the ironic thing is he did such a good job that this Hydra Cap actually found Red Skull not adherent enough to fascist principles, and so he kills the Red Skull.
Mm-hmm.
Because he says the Red Skull is not devoted enough to fascism
Mm-hmm.
to serve the great Hydra cause.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually awesome as far
Yeah.
as that goes. I wasn't aware of that in the story, but I kind of like that. I like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to pick up on the virtues?
Oh, well, I suppose being we are where we are, I suppose it's not that I want to get into in what way does he exemplify the or resemble the virtues. It's more of sort of what is it about Captain America's values, ethics, principles? Like, what kind of lessons do you want readers to take from Captain America's example
or character, right?
or character.
Mhm.
That really gets to the general purpose of the book, is that these, the virtues, thinking about honesty and integrity and humility, especially when I wrote the original book 10 years ago, before Captain America became so well known through the movies, because only one movie had been out before I wrote the book. And these, I don't think it's as much the case now, but definitely then these were largely written off as, old-fashioned, anachronistic, you know, like people would say to Cap in the comic books, World War II values.
Mm.
These were good enough for your black and white world back then, Cap, but right now we need, something different. And that something different may, is usually some form of utilitarianism, because that's portrayed as more realistic.
Right.
But, even if it includes some deontology as well, there's this, I guess you could say there's a fallacy of, I guess you could sort of call it an I don't want to, that word isn't coming to me. Algorithm. There's this fallacy in this day and age of tech and AI and everything, that, a formula or an algorithm can solve a problem. That any problem, we can write an algorithm to solve it. And, utilitarianism and deontology are both of the form that they can be put into rules or formulas or decision trees to make a decision.
Right.
And one of my, intellectual idols, Deidre McCluskey, economist, philosopher, many other things, has said ethics doesn't fit on a 3x5 card. It's not something that you can just, whip out and say, oh, let me look up on my card to see what the right thing to do is, or let me look at the formulas. Like you'd have a cheat sheet for a calculus exam with all the formulas on it, so you can just look and solve the problems. Not that you should do that, but, the idea that you can, that ethics can just be a quick reference matter, or can be lumped into a formula or an algorithm or AI, when it's more a matter of having a core ethical code, like Captain America does, of those basic virtues, and then a sound sense of judgment in order to solve conflicts between them, which can only be gained through experience and making decisions and seeing the ramifications and learning from that. And, this is all we really need to make ethical judgments. We don't need more refined formulas and no more precise algorithms. When it comes down to it, most things are pretty easily right or wrong. And when there's a conflict, it's usually not settled by formulas or rules. It has to be settled by thinking through and judging our some of it comes down to intuition. What decision can we sleep with at night? Which decision can we look at ourselves in the mirror afterwards? And I just think that style of philosophizing, which has definitely come back into style in the popularity of Stoicism in the last 10 years, and the popularity of virtue ethics, but, Stoicism warhand, is that, that lost favor in all the hullabaloo about algorithms and AI and formulas and precise ways of doing things. And I don't think that's necessary, and I think that can lead us astray. Like all the people that assume that algorithms are unbiased, that, algorithms, making decisions based on data are unbiased. When, of course, we all know that the data that these algorithms and AI are trained on are often biased, and they result in biased decisions.
Right.
So like all the results were, if you ask Google or ask AI, show me an attractive woman, and it usually shows a white woman.
Right, because you have to have
it
a
was
preference.
Trained by online data.
Right.
Of a bunch of white bros saying, of course, white women are more attractive. That's ridiculous. Yeah. Okay. But then they point to AI saying this, and they say, well, AI says it must be right. And they just don't see, or they don't want to admit that the AI is based on their own opinions, garbage in, garbage out. And that's why, again, if we rely too much on this, we kind of let me put it this way: when we use a formula or a system of rules or algorithms for ethical decision making, we're trying to distance ourselves from the results
Right.
when there's really no justification for doing that.
Mhm.
Okay, we chose those methods. We're responsible for the data they're making their decisions on. We
Right.
can't say, well, I'm letting the AI make the decision that's out of my hands. That's ridiculous.
Right. Because it's based on our preferences.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Oh man, wow. Talk about like clip-worthy content, man. That's like fucking phenomenal. All right. And unless you have something else you'd want to ask, I actually think that's a great endpoint.
I have to ask, are you going to see Deadpool 3?
Oh yeah. Oh
Mhm.
yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I
Definitely.
think it's another 2 weeks, something like
Yeah,
that.
2
Yeah,
weeks. Two
yeah,
weeks.
yeah. There's going to be Wolverine and Deadpool.
Yeah, that I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So something to look forward to.
I heard.
All right, fair enough. All right. So
And I assume a lot of cameos and Easter eggs and stuff, because the whole thing apparently is a joke that Deadpool's making about the multiverse. So I'm hoping we see just tons of people from all the different movies and media over the years.
I can't wait. I honestly can't wait because I know they revealed little things, right, to the audience in
Yeah.
these trailers recently. And then I hope that's not it and probably not going to be it in terms of spoilers. So, something to look forward to as far as that goes.
And I know. Well, from everything I read, I don't know, but from everything I read, is Marvel is really, hinging a lot of its cinematic future on this movie. This is the one that's supposed to revive
Oh wow.
Marvel Studios' prospects for the future. I've liked all the movies. I really like the Marvels. What else came out recently? I've liked most of the TV shows. So, I mean, I kind of dismiss a lot of the criticism about, Marvel's gone downhill because the movie The Marvels was released, I think, just at the end of the actors' strike, so no one
Right.
could promote it. And didn't do very well. And,
Loki season 2, I think, was really good. I don't know if you ever
yeah,
watched
yeah.
Loki, but
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so that was something that, like, gives you something to look forward to, as far as that goes. Any movies that were notable before the Marvels, hard to say, but I think you're right. The Deadpool movie will actually revive that interest, and
Well,
we're actually gonna get some
Shang-Chi was really good.
Oh yeah, that was
Again, it
awesome.
didn't
But that
get
was a
didn't
while
get a
ago.
lot of attention.
Yeah.
The Eternals, I think, did a lot of damage to the franchise. It was a good movie, but it didn't have any recognizable characters. Not even, I think, most Marvel Comics readers know many of the Eternals outside of Cersei, who was an Avenger for a while, and that was back in the 80s. So it had but then you could say Guardians of the Galaxy had a bunch of people no one knew either. But
Yeah,
that
but
had a lot
apparently
more
enough.
charming interaction between the characters. That had James Gunn's soundtrack. That had a lot of stuff going for it that overwhelmed the fact that no one knew who any of these characters was. Eternals was a very serious movie. It was supposed to be kind of cosmic in scope, but I don't think that really came across that well.
Yeah. But
And it had a
honestly, it was
great
good.
cast, but it, with all due respect to all the fantastic people in it, it didn't have like a huge megastar. I mean, Angelina Jolie was in it, and
Yeah.
Salma Hayek was in it, but I don't think these are the huge megastars that appeal to the typical Marvel Comics movie audience in the way that Robert Downey Jr. does, or Chris Hemsworth or Scarlett Johansson.
And it would be awesome if they actually show up in the Deadpool movie. I actually wouldn't be surprised. So that's
That would
something
be
to look
great.
forward
That
to.
would be great.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so if we wanted to follow your work, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
My website is at profmdwhite.com. I'm
Mhm.
also on Twitter and Instagram as profmdwhite, and Threads and Blue Sky and everything else.
I love it. Mark,
Awesome.
again, man, thank you so much, man. Dude, like
It's
these are
great.
literally
Fifth time's the charm.
I know, man. And I always appreciate what I love so much about these conversations is that for me, who really does not care for superheroes whatsoever, how insightful they tend to be. So,
Well, then I've done my job.
absolutely, man.
Awesome.
All right. Talk to you soon.
All right. Take care, guys.
All right. See ya.
All right, that was awesome. So, everyone, if you want to follow us, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On Twitter, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.